Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Roberto Alvarez. I'm the executive director of the GFCC. If this is your first time here, the GFCC, it's a global multi-stakeholder organization. We have members that are corporations, universities, government agencies, and private sector councils, chambers, federations, and alike. It's great to have you here today for our first ever Innovating Out of Crisis session. We're initiating a new project in partnership with Japan Science and Technology Agency, and this is our very first session. Please feel free to share ideas, to introduce yourself using the chat. We'll have two presentations today, and we will pull questions from the audience. So please be part of the conversation. We will introduce you to our speakers in a minute, but before we do that, I want to turn to GFCC President Deborah Wentz-Smith, who has been leading not just the GFCC, but the Council on Competitiveness on a variety of initiatives that are related to crisis preparedness and resilience. Deborah, over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon to all our colleagues and guests from around the world who are joining us for this very exciting inaugural session, Innovating Out of Crisis. And first, let me start by saying that the GFCC is very honored that our strategic partner is the Japan Science and Technology Agency, very important organization in Japan and globally, funding research and next generation innovation in the academic environment, but also with close ties to business. So I want to thank our colleague, Shimada-san, for his leadership and the entire JST team as well. I'll make just a few remarks because Roberto's going to introduce our fantastic speakers today, Professor Hayashi and also Dr. Wessing, and he will do nice introductions, but I will just say that having leaders in resilience from academia, such as Professor Hayashi, and then a business leader, such as Ms. Wessing, is going to be really showing the interconnectivity of these issues. We all know that we have lived through a very unforeseen and global crisis in the COVID pandemic over the last 3 years, really coming out of unexpected turbulence and leading to a tremendous transition in how we work and a transformation of how we live and work. The U.S. Council on Competitiveness has really been a thought leader in the concept of resiliency as a core driver of competitive advantage, productivity growth, and how we move to next stages in the development of all sectors of our economy: business, academia, the workforce, government, etc. We entered this work, and I will share this because it's very relevant to what we're doing today and going forward under the GFCC. We initiated this work really after the national security crisis of our 9/11 terrorist attacks. And the whole issue of security really came into the fore. How do you build security into all operations of every aspect, again, of business and academia and government? And what is the cost going to be? And how is this going to be accepted by society, by workers, by leaders? And we developed this thought leadership that security and competitiveness were really two sides of the coin, and that if security was seen as a productivity and innovation enabler, not only would it deliver the security that we needed to ensure that if such a thing happened again, not only could we respond, could we mitigate, but we could prepare so that we wouldn't have the tremendously negative outcome we had. And so looking at resiliency, enterprise resiliency as a competitive advantage really became a cornerstone of our work. We recently updated our seminal report, Transform, to again build on how what we have been doing after the COVID-19 pandemic drew on this, but also, unfortunately, many of the recommendations and the lessons learned and the best practices we espouse had not been deployed. So now we're in a situation where hopefully we're coming out of the COVID pandemic. And of course, there are other crises on the front, there always are. But under this initiative, we want to, yes, learn from the past. We're going to learn, of course, from how Japan as a nation dealt with the Fukushima disaster and in their energy supply and delivery. But also we're going to talk about, how do we look at crises again as an opportunity for innovation, an opportunity for transformation, opportunity for growth, and an opportunity to deliver, higher standards of living and well-being for all of our citizens. And I will close by saying, I think that the mantra of issues that we need to address in this initiative, looking at the innovation frontiers and how they drive the future societies and competitiveness through crisis and resiliency, is complexity. The issues now and the challenges are far more complex than ever. 2, we have to have a different style and way of communicating with all citizens, with all stakeholders. And the importance of cooperation is more than ever if we will innovate out of crisis and into new innovation futures of benefit to all. So we're very excited with this session. And it's, as Roberto said, it's the start of a new initiative under the Global Federation of Competitiveness Councils. And we look forward to all your participations and great questions and dialogues today. Back to you, Roberto.
Thank you, Deborah. I want to quickly turn to you, Shimada-san. You've been an amazing partner helping us to put together and kickstarting this new initiative.
Thank you, Roberto. I'm Kazuyoshi Shimada, Director of Washington, D.C. Office of Japan Science and Technology Agency. Last year at Frame the Future series organized by GFCC, we started discussion on our society's resilience. And throughout the discussion, we gradually recognized that crisis of our society is a phase shift of our society. The ability to transform our society throughout crisis must promote innovation as well as increase resilience. But the concept of this crisis is a little complicated, and it varies when we have different perspectives. On the other hand, when we confront a big crisis, we need to work together. And in order to work together, we need to share our recognition, even we are in different nations, timing, generations, industries, whatever. So I'm very happy to have this opportunity to discuss with global leaders and build a foundation sharing senses of crisis of our collaborative actions. That is a true value of GFCC provides, I believe. So thank you very much, Deborah, Roberto, and GFCC staffs to make this happen. And thank you very much, Professor Hayashi and Ms. Wessing, for your joining to ignite discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Shimada-san. As we heard, we're launching this new initiative, Innovating Out of Crisis. This new initiative, it aims to advance the understanding about crisis, draw lessons from past crises, identify research and development topics in order to better prepare businesses, countries, societies to face future crises. This is our first session. The idea here is to have 2 presentations. We'll get started with Professor Hayashi, and then Geraldine will introduce them in a minute. And for this session, we want to talk about things like, how can we recognize a crisis? How can we potentially anticipate the effects or the issues associated with an upcoming crisis? What are some of the best practices that nations, companies, cities should use to navigate this bumpy road that we're all driving through today? So to get started, and again, please be part of the conversation. We have now enabled the chat function here on Zoom, so you can be part of that. Shimada-san, I want to turn to you again. We have the 2 presentations, so maybe if you could introduce Professor Hayashi, and we go straight for his presentation. Each one of our presenters will have 7 minutes. Once Professor Hayashi is finished with his presentation, I will then introduce Geraldine and turn to her. Shimada-san, over to you.
Okay, I'm honored to have Professor Hayashi in this session. Dr. Hayashi is a president of National Research Institute for Earth Science and Disaster Resilience, and a professor emeritus of Disaster Prevention Research Institute, Kyoto University, where he has taught since 1994. And he is a leader of the community of disaster prevention and mitigation, so-called BOSAI in Japan. And the general focus of his work is on societal and human reactions to disasters, risk communication and education, information system for disaster management, standardization of emergency operations, and multi-hazard risk assessment. And as a leading researcher in Japan, he is a scientific committee member of the Integrated Research on Disaster Risk, IRDR, and which is so co-sponsored by the International Science Council and the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, UNDRR. And he received both his bachelor's and master's degree from Waseda University and PhD from UCLA in the field of social psychology. Welcome, Professor Hayashi. Please start your initial remark. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shimada, for your kind introduction. Let me spend my time to introduce the lessons we learned from various disasters we experienced in Japan. There are so many kinds of crises, but you can't choose your favorite crisis. You have to be prepared for all kinds of hazards. But I've been spending my time mostly on natural incidents, both forecasted and non-noticed. So that let me look back at how Japan responded to these natural disasters. This is the figure of the mortality in Japan between 1945 and 2021 due to natural disasters. But if you look at this, you could see the three major incidents which divide the time. The first one is 1959 Isebe typhoon, which killed more than 5,000 people. And second one is the 1995 Kobe earthquake, which was a near-field earthquake, which killed more than 6,000 people. And the third one is a 2011 Tohoku earthquake, which due to interplate earthquake and tsunami disasters, which killed more than 22,000 people. And then before the Isebe typhoon, we were response-only country because of so many dead due to past war. But this incident really makes us realize to make more integrated, proactive disaster management. So we spend so much money and effort on structural mitigation. And as this indicates, this is the data related to water-related disasters loss. As you can see, the loss getting smaller and smaller from almost 10% of our national GDP down to 0.1%. But if you look at the recent days, that decline rate is decreasing. That's one big problem. And then in 1995, Kobe earthquake happened. Very unexpectedly, it created the huge damage. That's created the new issue for recovery and increasing preparedness. And then we spent almost 15 years to promote that kind of thing. And then we finally figure out how that the recovery program should be structured. It's a three-tier model, infrastructure recovery at the base, a physical recovery and economic recovery on the second tier. And on the top of that, individual life recovery should be achieved. And all of these tiers should be simultaneously involved, but in eventually that success will be coming from the lower tier, from up to top. And then when 2011 Tohoku earthquake occurred, we again find out the importance of resilience, which is a combination of disaster reduction or prevention, I would say, and disaster recovery. How these two elements should be strategically integrated is become very, very important. And this is how I look at the past 70 years in Japan in terms of disaster management. But we are now facing much severe disaster in ahead. Around 2035, we're expecting to have a Nankai Trough earthquake, which is an interplate earthquake, which create the huge damage. And along with that, we also expect the Tokyo metropolitan earthquake, which is a very severe urban disaster. In both of these may create $3 trillion damage, which is 10 times bigger or 20 times bigger the damage that we have experienced. And how we could survive this disaster will be very important. But right now, we have separated in different sectors. I'm coming from natural disaster sectors. We do have seaborne sectors. We also have cyber attack sectors. We need to be more integrated in terms of prediction, prevention, and preparedness. And as a tool to promote such kind of integration, or I would say consilience of the knowledge, we propose the importance of an online synthesis system and use of facilitators. And this is almost like a web-like system, but beyond web or Google, this system will keep continuing accumulating knowledge and lessons of the previous disasters to help facilitators to solve the local problems and then integrate the knowledge on disaster risk reduction and hopefully climate change adaptation and sustainable development on a web basis. We would hope to keep on working to upgrade these systems in the near future. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Hayashi Sensei. I think this was an amazing presentation.
Yeah.
I think that you highlighted different types of happenings or events, but also this notion, very fundamental notion of learning, systematizing learning, and building new frameworks going forward based on your review of historical happenings in Japan. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you so much for your very good summary of my presentation. Thank you.
We will now turn to our second presenter, and let me introduce Geraldine Wessing. And maybe Professor Hayashi, if you could stop sharing your screen now.
Oh, sorry.
Hey, not a problem.
So, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Geraldine is the chief political analyst with Shell, the global energy company. She's based out of the UAE. She oversees globally the development of political scenarios. She advises on political trends and political risk globally. She leads the external environment assessment for Shell's country reviews. She also leads, builds, and develops country and global scenarios internally for Shell and in collaboration with third parties, university, government organizations, private sector organizations from across the globe. Very importantly, Geraldine is also the team's in-house scenarios training. That means she's in charge of disseminating the scenarios methodology and framework within Shell worldwide, providing introductory as well immersive scenarios training for colleagues to new scenarios and Shell strategy teams. She joined Shell Scenarios and the strategy group in charge of that in 2013 after various years in different functions at the corporate headquarters of Shell. She has a bachelor. She studied business economics and history at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands, and she got a master's in international relations at King's College, London. Geraldine, Shell has pioneered scenarios planning around the globe. So we are all very excited to see your presentation. You are muted, Geraldine. You are muted.
There we go.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Somebody muted me, you see. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Alvarez, Shimada-san. Thank you so much for hosting this. Professor Hayashi, wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. And Deborah, of course, very, very many thanks for welcoming us. Indeed, I'm here to present, I think, perhaps a slightly different perspective to innovating out of crisis. So I'm going to introduce you to the work of scenarios and how we aim to build resilience in times of crisis, or indeed ahead of crises if we can. So I'll just run through a few slides with you to give a bit of a background as to who we are, why we do this, how we do this, and I'll do it in 7 minutes, Roberto. So first, I do have to show this slide. I'm sorry, but it's really just if anybody's making investment decisions based on what I'm going to say. I'm not predicting anything in the future. I'm just talking about plausible scenarios. So don't make any investment decisions based on what I'm going to say. That's all it's trying to warn you about. So the first thing I'd like to just point out, and I'm sure many of you will know, Shell is a very large organization. We're a global organization. We operate in 70 different countries. We have over 82,000 employees. And as this rather attractive, I really like this image actually. It's from our annual report, but it really just sets out the breadth of customers that we supply a range of different energy solutions to. So I'm not trying to sell you Shell here. What I'm trying to just explain is that therefore, as a company, we are global. And as we know, an energy system touches all of our lives. So when we think about resilience and we think about crisis, we really do think about the broadest societal elements, driving forces in play. We're not just looking at one segment of society or one line of business. We're looking at the entirety. And we've been doing scenarios, as Roberto mentioned, we've been doing this for, over 50 years now. And we've been producing scenarios at a global level, which we publish. We have a website you can go and peruse through many years of scenarios production. But as you can see on this slide, we've been looking at global trends that have really been shifting and challenging societal norms and beliefs and values over the decades. And you can see here some of the really sort of profound paradigmatic changes that we've gone through as global societies over the decades. But I'd note that I thought it was quite revealing that the very last set of scenarios that we launched last year, called the Energy Transformation Scenarios, and then you'll see that we've got a little header there that says Volatility and Turbulence, Crisis as an Opportunity. Now, those scenarios were produced out of COVID. And the starting point for the scenarios was how we would recover from COVID and the different emphasis different societies would place on either wealth generation, strengthening security, or is it about health and well-being? And those three tensions, those three priorities actually really made the scenarios. But I think it's quite revealing because it really is a sign of the times of where we are, is that and increasing volatility and increasing uncertainty. But we also produce scenarios internally. We don't publish these scenarios at a country level, at a business level. And that is really to build resilience within our strategic frameworks, to test our existing strategy, but also to design new group or business strategies as well. So really quite comprehensive. So what do we mean by crisis? Well, as a large organization, we have different response mechanisms to different types of crises. I'm not going to be talking about the emergency response or the disaster response units. That's a very specific area of expertise that I can't speak to. But I can speak to these kinds of crises, right? Well, there's a lot of terminology here: significant event, decisive moment. And this is kind of the verbatim that we use within the, let's say, the strategy group when we think about uncertainty. Fundamentally, we are talking about critical uncertainties that could have significant impact on the company. And I mean by that, it could be financial, but it could also be physical impact. If there is a situation in a particular country where we need to evacuate our people, that's our asset. Our people are our most significant assets. Or it could be reputational. So there are lots of different uncertainties and areas of impact. And again, we look at the range. And we do this by producing scenarios, not forecasts. And the reason is that we believe that forecasts are built from one single set of assumptions that are rooted in, a single set of understandings of where we are today. However, we know that the nature of the system in which we operate is much more complex, especially when we're talking about critical uncertainty. And therefore, we need to understand much more holistically all the different driving forces and how they work together. So the starting point for scenarios is not one single set of assumptions, but actually very much an appreciation that we have multiple different starting points today that we can then extrapolate from. So really, producing scenarios is not just, it's not lovely stories about the future and it's sci-fi. There's a little bit of that, but actually it's really about building resilience by understanding the system behind change, the systems thinking approach. Lots of ways to do it. So these are just some of the techniques that we use. And again, it's to show you, there's a science behind this. And we really structure our approach to understanding the complex systems that are in play today that will influence the future nature of change. So in essence, we use scenarios in 3 types of, let's say, crisis response or in anticipation of crises upcoming. The first is literally as a response to a crisis that's happened. So here what we do is we produce the most likely base case scenario, but also the worst case scenario, because what we're trying to do is actually prepare for, the worst, right? So it's better to know and be prepared for the worst and hope for the best, but you better have your plan in place just in case things even deteriorate further. So that's really an immediate crisis response that we operate in. The second area is actually much more around where we do business, and if there's a sudden change in the environment. This could be, political change. It could be political upheaval. It could be a natural disaster. But it basically means that we don't quite know how this is going to resolve itself and turn the operating environment into a different future operating environment. How is this going to change? What is the nature of change? So here we produce scenarios very much to try and understand, again, systems thinking, the complexity of that bespoke local environment and why we're seeing change now. Why is it now? What's different today than before? And how significant can this change potentially be? And then the last area that we produce scenarios for is much more in anticipation. The global scenarios are an example of that, but we do this again also at local and regional levels. And it's really to actually monitor the signals and signposts that we observe in our environment to actually try and anticipate something different at play. So we're really looking for the different signals, the change in signals, so that we can then try and understand what that means for change into the future. So what we're actually trying to do is we're trying to avoid the black swan events. really take into account all the potential disruptors and not only then mitigate against those risks, but actually perhaps also capitalize on the opportunity. And then I'll just say one more thing about the black swans. Because black swan events, as we know, are low probability, high impact events, right? The curveball that you don't see coming, but when it hits you, it really hits you, right? These are the ones that we're not prepared for. But there's no real reason for us to not be prepared for black swan events, because any event truly does send off signals beforehand. The real question is whether we have the capacity, the technology to pick up the signals early on. And so even in my job, when I look at the country scenarios that we produce, we're looking for those earliest signals, the anomalies, the weak signals that point to something different and something new, because you never know, that might be precisely the signal that will lead to a disruption. That's my presentation, my introduction.
Thank you so much, Geraldine. This was amazing. I think two things that you comment really caught my attention. First, this notion that for sure crises are shifts, but they pose opportunities. And I think this is very much connected to what we've been doing in the GFCC with JST, innovating out of crisis. How can crisis also be a lever in some way to create new systems, new frameworks, to shift performance, to shift things that we're doing? And the other one, as you just said now, that any of those events, they send signals in advance, right? So sensing when those things are happening, it's critical. For our colleagues who are joining us, who are on the chat, feel free to ask questions. I want to turn to you, Deborah and Shimada-san, to get your questions. But I want to maybe to get it started and ask one thing, Geraldine and Professor Hayashi. How prepared were Shell in Japan to face COVID-19? What have you learned from the crisis that arose from the pandemic?
Who goes first?
You get it first.
Okay. We learn very, very slowly. And then we realized that how the society responded to these new types of crisis quite differently. And then as far as we are concerned, that the European countries and the US try to, in a sense, control this pandemics from a very a big perspective, so that the society set some kind of bans and regulations to control the how those new viruses behaves. But our nation was very difficult to do so. So that the only things we have been exposing for the last almost 3 years is ask in each individual to behave discreetly, and then making no national change so far. That is my very honest observation of how we responded to this COVID-19 pandemics from our nation's side, which suggests we have a very low ability to adjust or change our nations to upcoming evolving new situations. In that sense, we are very, very old country, which has very low adaptability to such kind of sudden changes. That was a very sad thing, I would say, but I do admit that we have experienced for the last 3 years. But thanks for the Japanese nation, people, I would say, they are very, very adaptive to the new situations. So that's a very clear contrast, very adaptive people and very inadaptive nation. That's my very honest observation about this COVID thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hayashi. Geraldine.
Well, so I'd make a couple of personal observations because ideally, we would have had scenarios on the shelf ready about a pandemic, and we didn't. Secondly, ideally, we would have been on the front foot in January of 2020, producing scenarios, but we didn't. We produced them in May. And it goes to show that for a company as ourselves, who are used to dealing with particular themes, we somehow didn't feel quite right about doing something different, right? This was a different topic that we haven't really been focused. Health is not usually something we look at. But I will say that by May, when we did produce the scenarios, and they are also available online, by the way. Sorry, I'm plugging scenarios left, right, and center here, but they're called Rethinking the 2020s. What we did is, again, we tried to understand the different, first of all, we really tried to understand the virus itself. And we tried to understand the different scenarios the virus itself could undergo. Then we tried to understand how different societies might respond. And that gave us 3 different scenarios. And there was an inevitable truth about those 3 different scenarios. And I think that is a really, really fundamental learning about scenarios. You look for what we call gray rhinos. They're the inevitable truths. They're conclusions that you can draw across all the scenarios. They're the givens. And one of the givens was that we weren't going to get out of the pandemic much, much, much before 2022. And that's actually a very profound piece of information. If you're a global organization and you're going to have to be thinking about business travel, digitalization, mental health significantly as well. So I think we could have done better. And now, of course, for me, it's been a wake-up call as well that, really, we're about systems thinking. We had never really considered health as directly impactful to our business. And yet, well, here we are. Yeah.
Thank you. A new connection as part of the broader system. Deborah, over to you.
Thank you. And let me thank our 2 speakers for really outstanding presentations. I want to comment on the last question from my perspective before I do ask a question to the group here. What was amazing, I think, in the United States was how quickly we began to innovate to actually develop a new vaccine that could deal with COVID. And it really underscored the importance and power of having invested very significant resources from the government in basic research at our universities, at our national labs, as well as our teaming with private sector leaders in the pharmaceutical industry to come together to apply novel techniques, the mRNA, and to really develop the whole, back to Geraldine's systems thinking, the whole system from research to production at scale of these vaccines so that they were really ready to be deployed at the end of 2020. And that's a tremendous accomplishment of innovation at scale, innovation at speed. And it shows that in a crisis, we can pull all the forces together to make that happen, drawing on new knowledge, new technology, and an innovation spirit. So that's one thing I wanted to share because, again, we're dealing with a whole new panoply of new technologies. And I want to ask at some point, both our speakers, how in their scanning and sensing the data are they now using machine learning and artificial intelligence and all the new tools we have to sense and understand the signals, but also how to integrate them. So my question really is, in a systems approach, how do you ensure that you actually are including everything that needs to be sensed, that needs to be looked at in the signals? I mean, Geraldine, you said that health had never really been on the radar. And yet we know, looking back to the HIV/AIDS pandemic and how it impacted particularly Africa, that it had a huge impact on productivity. You had swaths of a population who couldn't work. And so healthy outcomes have always been a driver of prosperity and success. So my question is, how do we ensure that we're looking at all the issues and not just what's in our comfort zone?
Would you like to go first, Geraldine?
Well, I think that one is addressed to me. I think great. So certainly, no, happy to. I think on the HIV point, Deborah, absolutely. And in fact, we did do work on HIV in the scenarios team in the 90s. And so, so it's ironic that, 30 years later, we seem to have, at a group level, at the global level, that became something that was, on the fringe, let's say, right, of our purview. And so, yes, how do you make sure that you incorporate these? And really, the problem with horizon scanning, right, which is really about sensing the environment and looking for all of these signals of change, is that with all this data available, is that you can become totally saturated. And so it's really about how do we discipline ourselves and how do we have the right expertise in-house to actually be able to pick up the anomalies early on, those weak signals that we were talking about, but also to be sufficiently humble to incorporate the breadth of issues that touch our lives. And so I think for me, I mean, I think I'm always going to say this, and I'm sure that my data analyst friends in the team will be, no, we need more technology, and technology can help. But fundamentally, I'm very much about the human approach. I'm very much about bringing the right experts in consistently, continuously to help us analyze what we witness emerging in the world, but also to really anticipate, how humans would respond, how diseases may be coming about in the future, given all of the trends that we know are in play at the moment. So I think technology is going to have a wonderful, and will continue to have a wonderful role to help us digest vast amounts of data and really pick up those broad trends, but also hopefully will help us highlight those anomalies. But we will need those experts that have, the long experience and have seen so many things so many times before to really tell us if this is different or not. So
I want to jump in and build on that and then turn to Professor Hayashi. How do you look at, since Shell's a global enterprise, how are you addressing the distinct factors?
I've been studying Shell's scenario planning activities for the last 30 years. And I've been admiring such a very nice way. And as for, I said that the prediction is very important, but it doesn't mean that we should have very clear specific scenario or the expected states, but we may have a range of phenomena which may occur, and that's very important. And then that's a kind of a thing that our national government lack at this moment. As for the next big one, Nankai Trough earthquake, national government proposed one single scenario, which is way, way big, which would happen. So that what is more important for us, for the nation, people, it is a kind of a range, how small or how big will be the event, and then how we could prepare depending on a small size event, a big size event, so that let the people have their own decision to cope with the upcoming event. that is very important thing. And then my learning about the Shell's planning approach is very shallow, but I do respect such kind of different kind of a scenario will be possible, and we should be prepared for each of those scenarios. That makes us more resilient to what would happen in the future. That's the great learning that I get from my reading through Shell approach. Yeah.
Wonderful. Shimada-san, we have several questions here, but I want to turn to you first.
Yes, as Deborah mentioned, what can I say? Recognizing methodologies is very important. I agree. But in terms of the what can I say? Story innovating out of crisis. I talked with Professor Hayashi about that issue, and he mentioned recognizing crisis is not enough, and we need to have a kind of perspective, what kind of future we would like to have. And it depends on a sense of communities and the sense of value of the community. So I would like to know the comments from Geraldine and Professor Hayashi about the community perspective, which use scenario planning or preparation for the future.
Who goes first?
Professor Hayashi, please go.
Okay. I think the community is a very real thing. And in order to get their power united, we need some kind of a scenario upon which they could coordinate their actions and goals. And in order to do that, the very realistic and reliable scenario, future scenario, is an indispensable element. So I'm expecting to have a very severe earthquake and tsunami damage in around 2035. But we try to provide at least 10 scenarios based on natural science observations. But given those, which grow out to 10 different cases, and then that each people in a different area will experience or learn what would happen to them. That kind of involvement of each people is very important for improve the resilience at the individual level. And then that the summation of such a activity will be a community activity. And then how we could create a coordinated, a single perspective about what's going to happen in the future is very, very important to make them effectively prepare for the future. So that I really appreciate those multiple planning approach, scenario approach as the basis for the future planning, even at the community level. That is my impression.
Yeah, Professor, thank you very much. The core precursor might be very important in order to facilitate making the scenarios. And Geraldine, do you have any experiences or comments on the community perspective to use scenario?
So we have this, so there's a couple of concepts that I'd like to introduce. One is, so we believe wholeheartedly in a concept called transformative collaborations, right? And that's truly to take people on a journey with you, because producing scenarios is a learning journey, right? It's not a show and tell. It's really exploring and producing something together. So very much at the community level, absolutely, this has a really profound impact on citizens, because you're taking them on a journey, and it's really about the art of reperception, about reframing the future, because the future doesn't exist yet. Right? It doesn't exist, and it could be created by ourselves. So by having different scenarios where you explore, sort of what will happen if we continue down a particular pathway versus an aspirational scenario, you can really, really take people on two very different journeys. And that is a personal journey. So, but it has to be relatable. So at the community level, it absolutely has to be rooted in the local traditions, the local culture, the local values. Otherwise, you're just talking theoretically, hypothetically. So again, that co-creation, the transformative collaborations piece, I think, is absolutely crucial. And I think it's not just at the local community level, but it's also with international groups. When we think about climate change and tackling climate change, it's at all different levels. But it's really about this collective journey that we're on together. And exactly as Professor Hayashi said, it's about creating alignment in understanding, creating a shared vision of the future, and crucially, how to get there. It's not just enough to have the picture, but what's the journey going to look like?
Sure.
Geraldine, thank you. So yeah, I should not say using scenario, but the scenario planning process is a kind of community building process as a whole. Thank you very much.
That's very true.
We have
given Geraldine comments that the scenario will lead the journey, and then that is very important. That we are now very much focusing on transformative capacity, using disaster the chance to make a better world. In order to make that happen, people have to think about new world before the things happen, and that is the key of a transformation. And then that the scenario will makes it possible for us to have a chance to think what will be the new world, a better world, before the event happens. So that in that sense, that her comments, it's very, very valuable, I think.
We have about 8 minutes to close our session here, and we have several questions. So what I thought is to have like 2 quick rounds. I'll get 2 or 3 questions for each one of those rounds, and then pose those to you, Professor Hayashi and Geraldine, and then we can have for the lightning round here. But before that, we got started mentioning this new initiative that we're launching in partnership with Japan Science and Technology Agency, Innovating Out of Crisis. So we will share here on the chat the link for the web page in which you'll find some preliminary information. And very importantly, for GFCC members, we have a call open. We want to engage researchers in the GFCC network to help us to do some exploratory research to move the needle in relation to the understanding about crisis and lessons from past crises. So please check that out. We will share the link here on the chat. I know that my colleagues, Vanessa and Simone, will do that in a minute. Yeah, we have it there. So several questions here. One of the things, it's really about, let's say, this is for you, Geraldine. It comes from our colleague, Chad Evans. Deborah mentioned Chad is in Japan this very day. I'll combine 2 questions here. One is, what are some of the big things that you have in your scenarios today? Yeah. What are you planning for today? What are some of the key topics that you see for your future scenarios? And related to that, another question that we got is, it's about trade-offs, the force that you put on building, developing several scenarios, right? And the cost, the time that's required for that, and in, let's say, and the results that you get.
Thank you. So on the first question, we are working on actually something quite exciting at the moment, but I can't really tell you about it because it's not ready yet to be published. But no, given the events, let me put it this way: given the events that have happened this year, but we've also had other signals in the last few years that that have increased, let's say the geopolitical uncertainties in the world. We are now updating our global scenarios, and so watch out, because we will be publishing something next year, hopefully, to be shared globally. And so yes, we are working on actually deepening the current scenarios and making them a little bit more interesting and granular, more significantly, regionally granular, I might add. And then in terms of the trade-offs and the resources, you're absolutely right, because we're a small team as well, actually. So it's not even it's also about human resources and how many projects can we actually lead, and how preemptively can we actually be functioning as a team, given that we are quite a few people. And so actually for me, the key is embedding the systems thinking mindset across the organization, so it actually becomes part of the DNA of Shell staff, because this is really something that should be happening actually at all levels, in all functions, in all jobs, is that we become much more aware of our environment, and that we all become much more able and capable of picking up early signals. Yeah, and then actually asking the so what question and talking to people with different perspectives. So on the human resource piece, I think it's really about embedding that practice, just that daily practice of being curious across the organization. And then in terms of how should we produce scenarios and stay humble, because I saw that as a question as well. I think that would be tremendous. For us, the focus is that we need to capture the breadth of relevant themes that will have direct impact on our business. That has to be within the boundary conditions of the scenarios. And then what the scenarios as a set give us are focus areas of challenges and opportunities that we can then focus the resources on, right? So when it comes to financial resources, capital, CapEx, all that kind of stuff, we can focus in on those particular areas. So they do give us an opportunity to focus in. It's a halfway house.
Yeah, two other quick questions here. One is about capacity building. We got a question more related to vaccines, but I think that we can generalize that, and I think I would like to pose that question to you, Professor Hayashi, and you, Geraldine. So, how much countries should be concerned about building capacity to produce vaccines in the future? But I would say we could generalize to capacity building and preparing resources, having resources in place to do that. Okay. And the other question to both of you, we got from our fellow Jerry Houghton, how to deal with unexpected events from 9/11 or very unlikely events, right? 9/11, the Russian invasion in Ukraine. What are your recommendations about those? Maybe we could get started with you, Professor Hayashi.
Okay, as for the vaccines, we just finished the 6th wave of the COVID-19. And then every wave getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So that if we look back, the first wave or second wave, that's almost nothing. But for the 6 waves, what we have doing is basically the same. But the difference which we made between these 6 waves are the power of vaccine. So that it is very important as a social level, we introduced new countermeasures to fight with the new hazard. So that in that sense, that the vaccine had played a very big role. That's my impression. Okay, thank you.
Shall I answer the second question given time? Yep. So for me, there are 2 techniques that I apply. One is to always have an outlier scenario as one of your scenarios. So whatever the fringe scenario is that some of the experts have said that will never happen, have it. Just have it. And I've been doing this since 2012, and by and large, they've actually, played out to some extent in some areas. So we've been good with that since 2012. We've been quite good. And then the second thing is to do is, once you've got your set of scenarios, and you take a step back and you take a more philosophical lens at the bigger questions at play, right? So you're going to make some general assumptions across the set. Ask the what if question, because if you've got assumptions that are similar across your set, there's something not quite right. So you need to ask the question, what if something very different happens? So that you do get that outlier scenario built in. So that would be, it's a simple technique, but it's one to keep in mind.
Okay, I think that let's go for our very quick final round here. We really ran out of time, but I want to give each one of you 1 minute for your final comments, right? And maybe your recommendation in order for folks who are here watching us, but industry, governments, to be better prepared to face future shocks. What would that recommendation be, Professor Hayashi and Geraldine?
Okay, yeah. As I mentioned earlier, the all-hazard approach will be very, very important for us. We're not just looking at the one disaster. It is very unexpected to face with the various kinds of disasters, so that to be ready for any kind of disasters. So all-hazard approach must be taken. That's my recommendation. Okay.
Geraldine?
Yeah, I concur. I think it's really about capacity building, and it's about really stimulating the education of systems thinking as just part of curricula across schools, across states, across nations. I think that's a given. And I think that absolutely, as Professor Hayashi said, the nature and complexity of the challenges that as humans we will be facing in the into this century are really quite shocking, and so I think having the personal resilience and the community resilience to be able to prepare for those, and really have policymakers as well embed that resilience and embed that sort of complex systems thinking approach. I think in policies, it has to be a must. We can no longer work in isolation or in silos.
Thank you so much, Geraldine. Professor Hayashi. Shimada-san.
Yeah, this was a very fruitful discussion. I understood the navigating crisis is we usually naturally in our daily lives we are using this activities navigating crisis. But it is difficult to do this in cooperation with more diverse stakeholders, community building in our society. But utilizing the input from Professor Hayashi and Geraldine, and also the audiences, Jerry input is about the International Science Reserve. We utilize those kind of resources to facilitate and integrate discussion in our project. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shimada-san. Deborah, over to you.
Thank you, Roberto. Well, let me again formally thank our two outstanding speakers and leaders. We couldn't have had a better choice for launching this important initiative with Japan Science and Technology Agency today. And as Roberto said, we have a lot of exciting work ahead under the auspices of the Global Federation of Competitiveness Councils that will be having its 2022 annual meeting and Global Innovation Summit in Athens, Greece this November, where we will continue to build out and launch this initiative. I just want to make a couple comments, sort of overarching. We know that crises and how we prepare, respond, learn, transition, and transform our societies and nations and the global commons have really been integral to all cultures and civilization writ large. 2, let me just share my 5 C's about how to navigate complexity, and crises going forward to co-create these new futures. The first, of course, is that crises are complex. 2, they're all connected, and this gets to our systems thinking. 3, we have to have clear communication to all stakeholders. We have to come together to make choices, and we have to communicate and collaborate with everyone in the globe to get to this new future. So this is really at the heart of the GFCC agenda around sharing best practices, collaborating, and co-creating. And so we're very excited going forward with the Innovating Out of Crisis initiative. So thank you, and turn it back to you, Roberto, and thank you and Shimada-san for your leadership.
Thank you, Deborah. We will share here in the chat, as Deborah has mentioned, the link for the GFCC 2022 Global Innovation Summit. It will be the first time in 3 years when the global GFCC community will meet in person in Greece on November from the 14th to the 18th. So please, I'll know that my colleagues will share the link here. Check it out. Join us there if possible. We'll continue this conversation as we're building the Innovating Out of Crisis project. We'll have another session on October the 21st. Deborah, our chairman, Chad Holliday, colleagues from Japan, from Ukraine, and other parts of the globe will be speaking on that occasion. So please check that out. We will have the information on the GFCC Innovating Out of Crisis page. I think I just want to comment 3 quick things. One is really how difficult it is in some way, the topics that we mentioned here, but the need for frameworks to address that complexity and difficulty, right? So even major players in the globe can have things that are in the blind spot. So we need like a conscious effort to bring those things into the space. And second, Deborah, I would like to add another C to your words, because you mentioned that in the beginning. I think that we need a change in mindsets. I think this whole concept of different worldviews can generate different outcomes in face of crisis. You stressed that a lot in the beginning. I think it's a very important message. And finally, as Professor Hayashi said, this notion of creating the future, not just reacting, but working together to create and make a certain future happen. I think they're fundamental things. There's one thing that we always do here, Professor Hayashi and Geraldine. We take a picture of our group. So please, I will invite my colleagues, Simone, Vanessa, who are here and who help us to put together the session and the project that we're building to look at the camera.
Okay.
And its bio. It was a pleasure to have you all here. Please check the resources that we shared. Geraldine, Professor Hayashi, we will be back to you separately. We would love to have your strategy team involved with the GFCC, Geraldine. We would love to have the National Research Institute for Earth and Disaster Resilience involved with the GFCC, Professor Hayashi. It was a pleasure to have you all here today.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you, Hayashi Sensei. Thank you, Geraldine.
Many thanks. Many thanks.
Thank you both.
Thank